The morning sun was barely touching the rooftops of the military base when Captain Arif Khan walked into the command office with the confidence of a man who believed the world owed him something. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a voice that could fill an entire room without even trying. Every soldier under his watch knew one thing about him very well. He never backed down from anyone. He questioned orders when he felt like it. He argued with senior officers when he thought he was right. And most of the time, people just let him have his way because nobody wanted to deal with the storm that came with disagreeing with him. Arif had earned his reputation over the years not just through his physical strength or his sharp tongue, but through a pattern of behavior that everyone around him had simply accepted. He had grown up in a small town where his father was the most respected man in the community. His father was a retired military officer himself, a man who had served with distinction and had come home with medals and stories that made young Arif believe that strength was the only thing that mattered in this world. His father never raised his voice at home, but outside he commanded respect, simply by walking into a room. Arif wanted that same power, that same ability to silence people just by being present. But somewhere along the way he confused respect with fear, and authority with arrogance. When Arif joined the military, he was one of the strongest recruits in his batch. He could run faster, lift more, and endure longer than almost anyone else. His instructors noticed him immediately, and within the first few months he had already made a name for himself. But it was not just his physical abilities that people noticed. It was also the way he treated those around him. He looked down on anyone he considered weaker. He mocked soldiers who struggled during training. He made comments that cut deep, and he never once apologized for any of them. His fellow recruits learned very quickly that Arif was not someone you wanted to cross. Not because he would hurt you physically, but because he had a way of making you feel small, insignificant, like you did not belong. As the years passed, Arif moved up through the ranks. He became a lieutenant, then a captain, and with each promotion, his ego grew larger. He believed that his success was proof that his way of doing things was the right way. He saw kindness as weakness. He saw patience as a waste of time, and he saw anyone who tried to correct him as a threat to his authority. There were many senior officers who had tried to put him in his place over the years, but Arif had a talent for turning every confrontation into a battle of egos, and most people simply did not have the energy to keep fighting him. So they let him be, and Arif took their silence as surrender. The base where Arif was stationed was a large one, home to several units and hundreds of soldiers. It was a place where discipline was supposed to be the foundation of everything, where rank was respected and orders were followed without question. But Arif had created his own little kingdom within this base. His unit operated the way he wanted it to, and his soldiers followed his rules, not because they respected him, but because they feared the consequences of not doing so. He would assign extra duties to anyone who questioned him. He would embarrass soldiers in front of their peers for the smallest mistakes, and he would take credit for the hard work of others without a second thought. There was one soldier in particular, a young man named Bilal, who had experienced the worst of Arif's behavior. Bilal was a quiet, hard-working soldier who had joined the military to support his family. He came from a poor background, and every month, he sent most of his salary back home to his mother and younger siblings. Bilal was not the strongest or the fastest, but he was dedicated. He showed up every day, did his work without complaint, and treated everyone around him with respect. But to Arif, Bilal was an easy target. Arif would call him out during drills, mock his accent, and make jokes about his background that left Bilal humiliated and the other soldiers uncomfortable. One evening, after a particularly harsh training session where Arif had singled out Bilal in front of the entire unit, one of the older soldiers, a sergeant named Tariq, pulled Bilal aside. Tariq had been in the military for over 15 years, and he had seen officers like Arif come and go. He knew that the military was full of men who used their rank to bully others, and he also knew that these men rarely lasted forever. But he could see that Bilal was close to breaking, and he did not want to lose a good soldier because of one bad officer. Tariq told Bilal to hang in there, that things would change eventually. He told him that the military was bigger than any one person, and that Arif's behavior would catch up with him sooner or later. Bilal listened quietly, nodding his head, but inside, he was not sure he believed it. He had been dealing with Arif's cruelty for months, and every day felt harder than the last. He had thought about requesting a transfer, but he knew that Arif would see it as a sign of weakness, and he did not want to give him that satisfaction. So he stayed, endured, and hoped that Tariq was right. Meanwhile, something was happening at the higher levels of the military that nobody on the base knew about yet. A major restructuring was underway, and several units across the country were being reorganized. New commanders were being assigned to different bases, and the chain of command was being shuffled in ways that had not happened in years. This was not just a routine change. This was a response to growing concerns about discipline, leadership quality, and the overall culture within certain units. Reports had been coming in from various bases about officers who were abusing their authority, soldiers who were being mistreated, and a general decline in morale that was affecting the effectiveness of the entire force. At the headquarters, a committee of senior officials had been meeting for weeks to discuss these issues and come up with solutions. One of the key decisions they made was to assign some of their most experienced and respected leaders to the bases that needed the most attention. And the base where Arif was stationed was near the top of that list. The reports from that base were not good. Multiple complaints had been filed, not just about Arif, but about several other officers as well. The culture of the base had become toxic, and the senior leadership knew that if they did not act soon, things would only get worse. The name that kept coming up in these meetings was Brigadier General Nadia Sayed. She was one of the few female generals in the entire military, and she had earned her rank through decades of service that had taken her to some of the most challenging postings in the country. Nadia was not the kind of leader who sat behind a desk and gave orders from a distance. She was known for being present, for walking the grounds, for talking to soldiers of every rank, and for making decisions that were fair, firm. She had a reputation that preceded her wherever she went, and that reputation was built on one simple principle. She treated everyone with respect, and she expected the same in return. Those who gave it received her full support. Those who did not learned very quickly that she was not someone to be tested. Nadia had grown up in a military family as well, but her experience was very different from Arif's. Her father had been a mid-ranking officer who never made it past colonel, not because he lacked ability, but because he refused to play the political games that often determined who got promoted and who did not. He was an honest man, a fair man, and he had raised Nadia to believe that true leadership had nothing to do with how loud you could shout or how many people you could intimidate. True leadership, he told her, was about making the people around you better, about lifting them up, not pushing them down. Nadia had taken those lessons to heart, and they had guided her throughout her entire career. She had faced challenges that most of her male colleagues never had to deal with. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and overlooked more times than she could count. There were officers who refused to take orders from her simply because she was a woman. There were moments when she was given the worst assignments, the most difficult postings, the tasks that nobody else wanted, in the hopes that she would fail and go away. But Nadia never went away. She took every challenge, every insult, every obstacle, and she turned it into fuel. She worked harder, studied more, trained longer, and proved herself again and again until there was nobody left who could question her abilities. By the time she reached the rank of Brigadier General, Nadia had earned the respect of almost everyone in the military. Her record was impeccable. She had led successful operations in some of the most dangerous areas of the country. She had turned around failing units and transformed them into some of the best-performing teams in the entire force. And she had done it all without ever raising her voice, without ever resorting to intimidation, and without ever compromising her values. She was proof that you did not have to be cruel to be strong, and that kindness and discipline could exist in the same person. When the committee decided to send Nadia to Arif's base, they knew exactly what they were doing. They needed someone who could not be intimidated, someone who would not back down from a confrontation, and someone who had the skills and the experience to fix what was broken. Nadia was all of those things and more. She accepted the assignment without hesitation, packed her bags, and prepared herself for what she knew would be a difficult task. She had read the reports about the base and she knew about the complaints. She did not know the specific names yet, but she knew the type. She had dealt with men like the ones described in those reports before, and she knew that the key to changing a culture was not to come in with force and fury, but to come in with clarity, consistency, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. Back at the base, life continued as usual. Arif went about his days the same way he always did, barking orders, belittling soldiers, and acting as though the base existed to serve his ego. He had no idea that change was coming. He had no idea that the complaints that had been filed against him and others had reached the highest levels of the military. And he certainly had no idea that the person being sent to take charge was someone who would challenge everything he believed about power, authority, and leadership. The soldiers on the base had heard rumors that a new commanding officer was being assigned, but nobody knew the details. Some hoped that the new commander would be better than the current one. Others feared that things might get even worse, and a few, like Bilal, simply tried not to think about it at all. He had learned that hoping for change was a dangerous thing, because when change did not come, the disappointment was almost worse than the suffering itself. Tariq, the old sergeant, had his own sources of information. He had a friend who worked at headquarters, and through quiet conversations and careful questions, he had learned that the new commander was not just any officer. It was Brigadier General Nadia Sayed. When Tariq heard the name, he felt something he had not felt in a long time. Hope. He had never served under Nadia directly, but he had heard stories about her from soldiers who had. Every single one of them spoke about her with a level of respect that was rare in the military. Not fear, not obligation, but genuine respect. The kind that came from seeing a leader who actually cared about the people under her command. Tariq wanted to tell Bilal, wanted to give him something to hold on to, but he decided to wait. He did not want to raise expectations before anything had actually happened. He knew that even the best commanders could be worn down by a toxic culture, and he did not want Bilal to get his hopes up only to be disappointed again. So Tariq kept the information to himself and waited, watching the days pass, counting down to the moment when everything at the base would change. The week before Nadia's arrival, the current base commander, Colonel Faisal, called a meeting of all the senior officers. Colonel Faisal was a tired man, a man who had spent the last few years of his career just trying to survive until retirement. He had long stopped caring about the discipline problems on his base, partly because he did not have the energy to deal with them, and partly because he was afraid of the officers who were causing the problems. Men like Arif had made Colonel Faisal's life difficult, and instead of standing up to them, he had simply looked the other way. He knew that his failure to act was one of the reasons the base was being reorganized, and he knew that his career was essentially over, but he still had enough decency left in him to feel ashamed. At the meeting, Colonel Faisal announced that a new commanding officer would be arriving the following week. He did not share many details, only that the appointment had been made by the senior leadership and that all officers were expected to cooperate fully with the transition. Arif sat in the back of the room, leaning back in his chair with his arms crossed. He did not look concerned. He did not look worried. If anything, he looked amused. He had seen commanding officers come and go, and in his experience, they were all the same. They came in with big ideas and strong words, and within a few weeks they learned how things really worked. Arif had outlasted every single one of them, and he was confident that this new one would be no different. After the meeting, Arif walked out with a few of his closest followers, other officers who had adopted his way of doing things, because it was easier to join him than to oppose him. They joked about the new commander, speculating about who it might be and how long it would take before things went back to normal. One of them mentioned that he had heard the new commander might be a woman, and the group burst into laughter. Arif shook his head, a smirk on his face, and said something that the soldiers standing nearby would remember for a long time. He said that if the military was sending a woman to fix this base, then they had already given up. The words hung in the air, sharp and ugly, and the soldiers who heard them looked at each other but said nothing. They had learned long ago that speaking up against Arif was not worth the trouble. But inside, some of them felt a quiet anger, a frustration that had been building for months and years. They were tired of Arif. They were tired of his arrogance, his cruelty, and his complete disregard for anyone who was not exactly like him. And somewhere deep inside, they hoped that this new commander, whoever she was, would be the one to finally put him in his place. The days passed slowly, as days always do when you are waiting for something that might change everything. The base continued to operate as it always had, but there was an undercurrent of tension that had not been there before. Soldiers whispered in the barracks, officers exchanged glances in the hallways, and everyone, from the lowest-ranking private to the most senior captain, felt that something was about to shift. It was the kind of feeling you get before a storm, when the air is heavy and still, and you know that the calm will not last. Bilal felt it too, though he did not know what to make of it. He went about his duties as he always did, keeping his head down and his mouth shut. But he noticed that Tariq seemed different lately. The old sergeant had a lightness about him, a quiet energy that Bilal had not seen before. When Bilal asked him about it, Tariq just smiled and said that sometimes, when you have been waiting in the dark for a long time, you start to notice even the smallest ray of light. Bilal did not understand what he meant, but the words stayed with him, turning over in his mind as he lay in his bunk at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the coming days would bring. And then, on a cool Monday morning, a black military vehicle pulled through the gates of the base, and everything that everyone had known, expected, and accepted was about to be challenged in ways that none of them could have imagined. The vehicle moved slowly along the main road of the base, past the training grounds, past the barracks, past the mess hall, and came to a stop in front of the command building. The driver stepped out, walked around to the passenger side, and opened the door. And Brigadier General Nadia Syed stepped out, looked around the base with calm, steady eyes, and took her first breath of the air that she was now responsible for. She did not smile. She did not frown. She simply stood there for a moment, taking it all in, and then she walked inside, ready to begin the work that she had been sent to do. Nobody knew it yet, but the base would never be the same again. The old ways were about to be tested, the old power structures were about to be shaken, and the man who thought he could never be challenged was about to meet the one person who would not look away, would not back down, and would not let him hide behind his rank or his reputation. The storm had arrived, and its name was Nadia. The first thing Nadia did after stepping into the command building was something that nobody expected. She did not go to the office that had been prepared for her. She did not sit behind the large wooden desk and start reading files. She did not call a meeting of the senior officers to announce her arrival and lay down the new rules. Instead, she changed into her field uniform, put on her boots, and walked out onto the base grounds. She wanted to see the place with her own eyes, to feel the rhythm of the base, to observe how people moved, how they talked, how they looked at each other. She had learned long ago that you could read an entire organization just by walking through it quietly and paying attention. The files and reports could tell you what happened, but only your own eyes could tell you why. As she walked through the base, soldiers noticed her immediately. Word had spread that the new commanding officer had arrived, and the sight of a female brigadier general walking the grounds in the first hour of her arrival was unlike anything they had experienced before. Most commanding officers spent their first day in meetings and administrative tasks. They usually did not appear in public until a formal introduction was arranged. But here was Nadia, walking calmly past the training grounds, nodding at soldiers who saluted her, and stopping occasionally to watch drills being conducted. She observed everything with the careful attention of someone who had spent decades learning to read situations. She noticed how the junior soldiers flinched slightly when certain officers walked past them. She noticed how some soldiers seemed to carry an invisible weight on their shoulders, the kind of heaviness that came not from physical exhaustion, but from emotional burden. She noticed the way conversations went quiet when officers approached, and how the laughter that existed among small groups of soldiers disappeared the moment someone with authority came near. These were all signs, small and quiet, but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. This was a base where fear had replaced respect, where silence had replaced communication, and where survival had replaced service. Nadia spent the entire first day observing. She spoke very little, asked very few questions, and gave no orders. Some of the officers found this unsettling. They had expected the new commander to come in strong, to make big announcements and demand immediate changes. The fact that she was simply watching made them nervous, because a leader who observes before acting is far more dangerous than one who acts before thinking. A leader who watches knows where the cracks are, knows where the weaknesses hide, and knows exactly where to apply pressure when the time comes. Arif, on the other hand, was not nervous at all. He had watched Nadia from a distance as she walked the base, and he had already formed his opinion. He saw a woman in uniform, and in his mind, That was all he needed to see. He told his fellow officers that this was going to be easy, that the new commander would spend a few weeks pretending to make changes and then settle into the same routine as everyone before her. He was so confident in his assessment that he did not even bother to learn her full record. If he had, he might have been a little less comfortable. But Arif never researched anyone he did not consider a threat, and in his world, no woman could ever be a threat. On the second day, Nadia called her first meeting. It was not a meeting of the senior officers, as everyone had expected. Instead, she called a meeting of the junior soldiers, the lowest-ranking men and women on the base. This was unprecedented. In all their years of service, not a single one of them had ever been invited to a meeting with the base commander. They filed into the large conference hall nervously, unsure of what to expect, unsure of whether this was some kind of test or trap. They sat in rows, back straight, eyes forward, waiting. Nadia walked in, stood at the front of the room and looked at them. She did not stand behind a podium. She did not have notes or a presentation. She simply stood there, her hands clasped behind her back, and spoke to them in a voice that was calm, clear, and warm. She told them that she was there to listen. She told them that she wanted to hear about their experiences on the base, their challenges, their concerns, and their suggestions. She told them that nothing they said would be held against them, and that their honesty would be treated with the respect it deserved. And then she asked them a simple question. She asked them if they felt proud to serve at this base. The silence that followed was louder than any answer could have been. The soldiers looked at each other, uncertain, afraid, wanting to speak, but not knowing if it was safe. Nadia waited. She did not rush them, did not pressure them, did not fill the silence with her own words. She just waited, because she knew that trust was not something you could demand. It was something you had to earn, and earning it started with giving people the space to decide for themselves whether they believed you. Finally, a young woman in the second row raised her hand. Her name was Sana, and she had been at the base for just over a year. She was one of the few female soldiers stationed there, and her experience had been difficult from the very beginning. She spoke softly at first, her voice trembling slightly. But as she continued, her words grew stronger. She talked about the disrespect she faced daily, the comments that were made about her behind her back, and sometimes to her face. She talked about how she had reported incidents to her superiors and nothing had happened. She talked about how she had started to wonder if she had made a mistake by joining the military, not because the work was too hard, but because the people were too cruel. When Sana finished speaking, something remarkable happened. Another soldier raised his hand, then another, and another. Within minutes, the room was filled with voices, each one sharing a piece of the truth that had been buried under layers of fear and silence. They talked about officers who abused their power, about punishments that were unjust, about a culture that rewarded loyalty to individuals rather than commitment to principles. They talked about feeling invisible, about feeling like their service did not matter, about losing faith in the system that they had sworn to protect. Nadia listened to every single word. She did not interrupt. She did not defend the institution. She did not make excuses. She simply listened, and as she did, she felt the weight of their pain, and she made a silent promise to herself that she would do everything in her power to make it right. This was why she had come. Not for the promotion, not for the recognition, but for these people, these soldiers, who had given themselves to a cause and had been let down by the very leaders who were supposed to protect them. After the meeting, Nadia went back to her office and spent the rest of the day going through the files. She matched what the soldiers had told her with the official records, and what she found was both predictable and infuriating. Complaints had been filed and ignored. Investigations had been started and quietly closed. Disciplinary actions had been recommended and never carried out. The system had failed these soldiers at every turn, and the people responsible for that failure were still walking around the base as if they had done nothing wrong. One name appeared more frequently than any other in the complaints: Captain Arif Khan. The reports about him painted a picture that Nadia recognized all too well. She had seen men like him throughout her career, men who mistook volume for strength and intimidation for leadership. Men who believed that their rank gave them the right to treat others however they pleased. Men who had never been held accountable because the people above them were either too weak or too complicit to do anything about it. Nadia did not make any immediate moves. she was not impulsive, and she knew that acting too quickly could backfire. She needed to build her understanding of the base, establish her authority, and create a foundation of trust with the soldiers before she started making the difficult decisions that she knew were coming. But she also knew that she could not wait too long, because every day that passed without action was another day that the soldiers suffered, and another day that men like Arif felt empowered to continue their behavior. Over the next 2 weeks, Nadia implemented a series of changes that were subtle but significant. She restructured the daily schedule to include more collaborative training exercises, the kind that required officers and soldiers to work together as equals. She opened a direct communication channel where soldiers could report concerns anonymously without going through their immediate superiors. She began conducting surprise inspections, not to catch people making mistakes, but to observe how officers treated their subordinates when they thought no one was watching. And she made it a point to be visible, to walk the base every day, to eat in the mess hall with the soldiers, to attend training sessions and observe drills. These changes did not go unnoticed by Arif. At first, he dismissed them as the typical actions of a new commander trying to make a good impression. But as the days passed, he began to feel something he was not used to feeling. The anonymous reporting system was a particular source of irritation for him because it meant that his soldiers could now complain about him without having to face him directly. He saw this as cowardice, as a threat to the order he had established. He began making comments about the new system during drills, mocking it, calling it unnecessary, and warning his soldiers that anyone who used it would regret it. When word of Arif's comments reached Nadia, she did not react immediately. She filed the information away, adding it to the growing picture she was building. She was patient, methodical, and she knew that the right moment would come. She also knew that when it did, she would need to be ready, because Arif was not the kind of man who would accept correction quietly. He would push back, and when he did, she would need to be standing on solid ground. The first real confrontation between Nadia and Arif happened during a routine inspection of his unit. Nadia had scheduled inspections for all units on the base, and Arif's was among the last. When Nadia arrived at his unit's quarters, Arif was standing at the front, his chest puffed out, his shoulders back, every inch of him projecting the image of a man who was in control. His soldiers were lined up behind him, standing at attention, their faces blank and their eyes empty. Nadia walked along the line of soldiers, inspecting their uniforms, their equipment, their posture. Everything was technically in order. Arif ran a tight ship, at least on the surface. But Nadia was not looking at the surface. She was looking at the eyes of the soldiers, at the way their jaws were clenched, at the way their hands trembled slightly at their sides. She was looking for fear, and she found it in every single face. She stopped in front of Bilal. He was standing at attention, his uniform clean and pressed, his boots polished to a shine, but his eyes told a different story. They were the eyes of a man who had been beaten down so many times that he no longer expected anything to change. Nadia looked at him for a long moment, and something passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the truth that both of them knew, but that neither of them could say out loud. Not yet. Nadia turned to Arif and asked him a few standard questions about the unit's performance, their training schedule, and their readiness for upcoming exercises. Arif answered confidently, his tone bordering on dismissive. He spoke to Nadia the way he spoke to everyone else, with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he was the most important person in every room he entered. He did not use the proper forms of address that her rank required, did not stand at full attention when speaking to her, and he made several comments that were designed to subtly undermine her authority. References to how things had been done before she arrived, implications that her new methods were disrupting the efficient operation of his unit. Nadia noticed all of it. Every disrespectful tone, every casual dismissal, every attempt to assert dominance. But she did not respond to any of it. She simply nodded, made notes in her file, thanked him for his time, and walked away. Arif watched her go, and a small smile crossed his face. In his mind, he had just proven his point. He had challenged her authority, and she had done nothing. She was weak, just as he had expected. He turned to his soldiers with a look that said, "You see, nothing changes." But Arif had made a critical miscalculation. He had mistaken Nadia's silence for weakness, her patience for passivity, and her restraint for fear. He did not understand that Nadia was not the kind of leader who reacted in the moment. She was the kind of leader who watched, waited, and then acted with a precision that left no room for argument or escape. She had seen everything she needed to see during that inspection, and she had made her decision. Arif would be dealt with, but it would happen on her terms, in her time, and in a way that he would never forget. In the days that followed, Arif grew bolder. He took Nadia's silence as permission to continue as before, and he pushed the boundaries even further. He began openly criticizing her policies during officer meetings, questioning her decisions in front of other commanders, and making comments about her leadership that were thinly veiled attacks on her gender. Some of the other officers were uncomfortable with his behavior, but none of them spoke up. They had been conditioned by years of silence to believe that challenging someone like Arif was not worth the risk. But something else was happening on the base that Arif did not notice because he was too focused on himself. The soldiers were changing. The anonymous reporting system that Arif had mocked was being used frequently, and the reports were being read, documented, and taken seriously for the first time. Soldiers who had been afraid to speak up were beginning to find their voices. Training exercises that brought officers and soldiers together were slowly breaking down the walls of fear that had been built over years. And the daily presence of a commander who walked among them, listened to them, and treated them with respect was having an effect that no amount of intimidation could match. Bilal was one of the soldiers who felt this change most deeply. He had been skeptical at first, as he had learned to be. But as the days passed, he noticed that things were different. The anonymous complaints he had filed about Arif were not being ignored. He could feel a shift in the air, a sense that someone was actually paying attention. And for the first time in a long time, Bilal began to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. Tariq saw the change too, and he allowed himself to feel something he had been holding back for years: pride. Not the kind of pride that comes from personal achievement, but the kind that comes from watching someone you respect do the right thing. He watched Nadia from a distance, observed how she handled every situation with grace and strength, and he knew that the base was in good hands. He also knew that the storm he had been sensing was getting closer, and that when it finally broke, it would be Arif who would be caught in its center. The tension on the base continued to build, day after day, like pressure in a sealed container. Everyone could feel it. The soldiers could feel it in the way Arif's behavior grew more erratic, more aggressive, as if he sensed that his grip on power was loosening. The officers could feel it in the way Nadia's presence filled every room she entered, calm and steady, like the eye of a hurricane. And Nadia could feel it in the reports she received every evening, each one confirming what she already knew. The base was ready for change, and the only thing standing in the way was a man who refused to believe that a woman could be his superior. The moment that everyone had been waiting for, whether they knew it or not, was approaching fast. It would not come in the form of a dramatic showdown or a public spectacle. It would come in the quiet, devastating way that true authority always manifests, through a single statement, spoken with absolute conviction, in a moment where there was no room for doubt, no space for argument, and no possibility of retreat. And when that moment came, it would be Arif who would be forced to confront a truth he had spent his entire life avoiding. That real power was not about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about being the one that everyone listens to when the room goes silent. Nadia was preparing for that moment, carefully and deliberately. She had gathered all the evidence she needed. She had documented every violation, every complaint, every instance of misconduct. She had spoken to soldiers, reviewed records, and built a case that was airtight and undeniable. She was not going to act out of emotion or impulse. She was going to act out of duty, out of responsibility, and out of a deep, unwavering commitment to the soldiers who had trusted her with their truth. The night before the confrontation, Nadia sat alone in her office, the files spread out before her on the desk. The base was quiet outside, the kind of deep silence that falls over military installations after midnight. She thought about her father, about the lessons he had taught her, about the values he had instilled in her. She thought about every obstacle she had overcome to reach this point, every insult she had endured, every doubt she had faced, and she thought about the soldiers who were counting on her, the Bilals and the Sanas and the Tariqs who had suffered in silence for too long. She closed the files, turned off the desk lamp, and looked out the window at the dark, still base. Tomorrow, would be the day. Tomorrow, everything would change, and she was ready. She had been ready her entire life. The morning air was crisp as the sun rose over the base, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Soldiers were moving to their stations, officers were beginning their rounds, and the base was waking up to what seemed like just another ordinary day. But Nadia knew better. She had already set the wheels in motion. She had called a meeting for that afternoon, a full gathering of all officers on the base, and she had made sure that every single one of them would be there. No exceptions, no excuses. The message had been clear and direct, just like everything else she did. Arif received the notice and shrugged it off. Another meeting, another performance. He would go, sit in the back as he always did, and wait for it to be over. He had no idea that this meeting was different from every other meeting he had ever attended. He had no idea that this was the meeting where his world would tilt on its axis, where everything he believed about himself and his place in the world would be challenged by a woman who stood barely 5 feet 5 inches tall, but carried the weight of an entire institution on her shoulders, with more grace and strength than he could ever imagine. As the hours passed and the afternoon approached, a strange quiet settled over the base. Soldiers went about their duties, but there was an awareness in the air, a sense that something significant was about to happen. Tariq felt it as he walked past the command building, and he paused for a moment, looking up at the window of Nadia's office. The light was on. She was in there preparing, and Tariq, who had been a soldier for more years than most people on this base had been alive, felt a certainty in his bones that today was the day the wind would change direction. The conference hall filled slowly that afternoon, officers filing in, one by one, and taking their seats with the practiced calm of men and women who had attended hundreds of such meetings before. The room was large, with high ceilings and rows of metal chairs arranged in neat lines facing a raised platform at the front. Windows along one wall let in the golden afternoon light, casting long rectangles of warmth across the cold tile floor. The air inside was thick with the smell of polished boots and pressed uniforms, and beneath it all, something else, something electric and unnamed that made even the most seasoned officers shift in their seats. Arif walked in with his usual swagger, nodding to a few officers he considered friends and ignoring the rest. He chose a seat near the back, leaning against the wall with his legs stretched out in front of him, his cap tilted at a casual angle that said everything about how seriously he was taking this gathering. He had his arms folded across his chest, and there was that familiar smirk on his face, the one that told the world he believed himself untouchable. A couple of officers near him exchanged glances but said nothing. They had learned that it was easier to let Arif be Arif than to invite his attention. At exactly 3 o'clock, the side door opened, and Brigadier General Nadia Sayed walked in. She moved with the kind of measured calm that only comes from absolute certainty. She was wearing her full dress uniform, every medal in its proper place, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes were clear and focused, the eyes of someone who had already mapped out every possible outcome of what was about to happen and had prepared for all of them. She carried a single folder in her left hand, thin but heavy with consequence. She stepped onto the raised platform, placed the folder on the small table beside her, and stood facing the room. She did not rush to speak. She let the silence build, let it press against the walls and fill the spaces between the chairs. She scanned the room slowly, making eye contact with officer after officer, and each one who met her gaze felt something shift inside them, a recognition that this was not going to be a routine address. When her eyes reached Arif in the back of the room, she held his gaze for a moment longer than the others. He stared back with his usual defiance, but something flickered behind his confidence. A tiny crack in the wall he had spent years building around himself. Nadia began to speak. Her voice was not loud, but it carried to every corner of the room with a clarity that made amplification unnecessary. She started by talking about the purpose of military service, about the oath that every person in that room had taken when they first put on the uniform. She spoke about duty, about honor, about the responsibility that came with rank and authority. She did not lecture. She did not preach. She spoke the way a surgeon operates, with precision and purpose, every word placed exactly where it needed to be. She talked about what she had observed during her first weeks on the base. She described the fear she had seen in the eyes of junior soldiers, the silence that fell over groups when officers approached, the culture of intimidation that had replaced the culture of excellence that a military base was supposed to embody. She spoke about the complaints she had reviewed, the stories she had heard, the patterns of behavior that had been allowed to continue unchecked for far too long. And as she spoke, the room grew quieter and quieter, until the only sound was her voice and the occasional creak of a chair as someone shifted uncomfortably. Arif listened with growing irritation. He did not like the direction this was going. He did not like the way Nadia was describing the base, because the base she was describing was the base he had helped create. Every word she spoke felt like a finger pointing directly at him, and the walls of the room seemed to close in slightly with each sentence. But he told himself that she was speaking in generalities, that she was not naming anyone specifically, and that as long as she did not single him out, he could weather this storm the way he had weathered every storm before. Then Nadia paused. She reached for the folder on the table and opened it. The sound of the pages turning was absurdly loud in the silence. She looked at the contents for a moment, then looked up, and this time, her eyes went directly to Arif. Not a general scan of the room, not a sweeping glance. She looked at him the way a predator looks at prey. It has been tracking for weeks, with patience that had finally reached its end. She began to read from the reports. She did not name him yet. She read accounts from soldiers who described being humiliated during drills, being punished for asking questions, being mocked for their backgrounds, their accents, their family situations. She read about training sessions that were used as opportunities for personal vendettas, about duty assignments handed out as punishments for perceived disloyalty, about a climate of fear so pervasive that soldiers had stopped reporting problems because they believed nothing would be done. With each account she read, the room seemed to shrink further, and Arif felt the attention of every officer shifting toward him. Not because Nadia was looking at him, but because every single person in that room knew exactly who she was talking about. When she finished reading the last account, Nadia closed the folder and set it back on the table. She stood silent for a moment, letting the weight of what she had just shared press down on the room. Then she spoke again, and this time her words were not general, they were specific. She said that a military officer's rank was not a personal possession. It was a responsibility entrusted to them by the nation and by the soldiers who served under them. She said that any officer who used their rank to harm, humiliate, or terrorize the people they were supposed to lead had betrayed that trust in the most fundamental way possible. She said that such behavior would no longer be tolerated on her base, and that the time for warnings and second chances had passed. Arif could feel his heart beating harder in his chest. He could feel the eyes of every officer in the room burning into him. He could feel the ground beneath his feet becoming less solid, as if the certainty he had carried his entire life was being dissolved word by word. But he was not the kind of man who stayed quiet when he felt cornered. He was the kind of man who fought back, who pushed harder when pushed, who believed that the best defense was an overwhelming offense. And so, despite every instinct that should have told him to stay silent, Arif did what Arif always did. He stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against the tile floor echoed through the hall like a gunshot. Every head turned toward him. Every breath was held. Arif stood tall, his shoulders squared, his jaw set, and he looked directly at Nadia, with the kind of open challenge that had made lesser men back down and stronger men think twice. He spoke, and his voice was loud enough to fill the room without effort. He said that he had been listening to everything she had said, and that while he respected her position, he disagreed with her assessment of the base. He said that discipline required strength, and that the soldiers under his command performed well because he held them to a high standard. He said that what she called intimidation, he called motivation, and that the military was not a place for soft leadership or gentle corrections. He said that the soldiers who had complained were the same soldiers who could not handle the demands of service, and that instead of listening to them, the command should be asking why they were not performing at the level that was expected of them. The room was absolutely still. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Every eye was on Arif, and then every eye shifted to Nadia, waiting to see how the general would respond to a captain who had just openly challenged her in front of the entire officer corps. Nadia looked at Arif. She did not blink. She did not flinch. She did not show anger or surprise or frustration. Her expression was the same steady calm that she had carried with her since the first moment she had stepped onto this base. She let his words hang in the air for a long moment, giving them the space to reveal themselves for what they truly were. Not an argument or a defense, but the desperate thrashing of a man who felt his power slipping away. And then she spoke. She spoke calmly, clearly, and with a weight that pressed every person in that room deeper into their seats. She addressed him directly, using his rank and name, Captain Arif Khan, and she told him that she had reviewed his record in its entirety. She told him that she had read every complaint filed against him, every account from every soldier he had mistreated, and every report that had been buried or ignored over the years. She told him that what he called motivation was documented as harassment, and what he called discipline was documented as abuse of authority. Arif opened his mouth to respond, but Nadia continued without pause, her voice cutting through his attempt to interrupt the way a blade cuts through paper, cleanly and completely. She told him that his record showed a consistent pattern of behavior that was incompatible with the standards of the military, that his conduct had damaged the morale and readiness of his unit, and that his treatment of the soldiers under his command was a disgrace to the uniform he wore. She said each word with the precision of someone who had considered every syllable before speaking it, and each word landed with the force of absolute certainty. Arif felt something he had not felt since he was a child, standing in front of his father after breaking a window with a cricket ball. He felt exposed, not angry, not defiant, not ready to fight back, but genuinely, deeply exposed. The armor of arrogance that he had worn for years, the shield of loudness and aggression that had protected him from accountability, was being peeled away piece by piece in front of every officer on the base. And the person doing it was not shouting. She was not threatening. She was not using any of the tactics that Arif himself would have used. She was simply telling the truth, and the truth was a weapon far more powerful than anything Arif had ever wielded. He gathered himself and tried once more. He raised his voice louder this time and said that she could not speak to him this way, that he had years of service, that he had earned his rank through sweat and sacrifice, and that he would not be talked down to by anyone. He took a step forward, his body language aggressive, his jaw tight, his eyes blazing with the kind of fury that had made grown men look away. But Nadia did not look away. She stood on that platform, feet planted, shoulders back, and she looked at Captain Arif Khan with an expression that carried the weight of every challenge she had ever faced, every battle she had ever won, every moment of doubt she had ever overcome, and then she said the words that would change everything. She said them calmly, without raising her voice, without breaking eye contact, without a single tremor in her tone. She said them with the quiet authority of someone who did not need to prove anything to anyone, because her entire life had been the proof. She said, "I am your general." 4 words. That was all. 4 words, spoken into a silence so complete that you could hear the dust settling in the beams of sunlight that crossed the room. 4 words that contained within them the full force of rank, authority, duty, and decades of service that Arif could not match, could not challenge, and could not dismiss. 4 words that reminded every person in that room that authority was not something you took by force or held through fear. It was something you earned through sacrifice, integrity, and an unwavering commitment to the people you served. Arif stopped, not gradually, not reluctantly, but completely. He stopped the way a man stops when he runs full speed into a wall he did not see. His mouth, which had been open, ready to fire back another volley of defiance, closed. His hands, which had been clenched into fists at his sides, loosened. His shoulders, which had been raised in aggression, dropped. And his eyes, those fiery, challenging eyes that had stared down so many people before, lost their flame. Not because they had been defeated by a greater force of anger, but because they had been met by something they had never encountered before. Absolute, unshakable authority that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. The room was frozen. Officers who had spent years under Arif's shadow watched as the man they had feared, followed, and enabled stood speechless in front of a woman he had dismissed from the moment he heard she was coming. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. In those seconds, something fundamental shifted on the base. The old order, the order built on fear and arrogance and unchecked power, cracked. It did not shatter all at once because cultures do not change in a single moment. But the crack was deep and it was irreversible, and everyone in that room knew it. Nadia held Arif's gaze for a moment longer, and then she spoke again. She told him that effective immediately, he was being placed under formal review for his conduct. She told him that during the review period, he would be relieved of his command, and his unit would be reassigned to a new officer. She told him that the review would be thorough, fair, and conducted according to the full standards of military justice. And she told him that if the review confirmed what the evidence already suggested, he would face the appropriate consequences. She said all of this without malice, without satisfaction, and without any trace of personal triumph. She said it the way a surgeon delivers a diagnosis, with honesty, precision, and the knowledge that the truth, however painful, was the first step toward healing. Arif stood in the back of that room, alone in a way he had never been alone before. The officers around him had already begun to distance themselves, not physically, but in the way that people distance themselves from someone whose power has evaporated. The friends who had laughed at his jokes and supported his behavior looked away. The allies who had followed his lead found sudden interest in the floor, the ceiling, anywhere but his face. He was alone with the consequences of his own choices, and for the first time in his life, there was no one to blame, no one to intimidate, and no way out. He sat down. Slowly, heavily, like a man who had been carrying something for a very long time and had finally been forced to put it down. He sat in that chair and he stared at the floor, and the room moved on without him, because that is what happens when the thing holding a system together is not strength but fear. When the fear is removed, the system reorganizes itself around something better, and the source of the fear is simply left behind. Nadia concluded the meeting with a message that was directed not at Arif, but at every officer and soldier on the base. She told them that the changes she was implementing were not punishments. They were corrections. She told them that a military base was only as strong as the trust between its members, and that trust had to be rebuilt from the ground up. She told them that she expected every officer to lead with integrity, to treat every soldier with dignity, and to hold themselves to the same standards they expected of others. And she told them that she would be there. Every day, walking the base, watching, listening, and making sure that the promises she was making today were kept tomorrow and the day after that. When the meeting ended and the officers filed out, the base felt different. It was not a dramatic transformation, not the kind of change you see in movies where everything is fixed in a single scene. It was quieter than that, subtler. It was the feeling of air after a storm has passed, clean and open and full of possibility. Soldiers who had been watching from a distance, who had heard about the meeting through the rapid network of military gossip, walked a little taller that evening. Conversations in the barracks were different. There was laughter, real laughter, not the forced kind that existed only in the absence of authority. Bilal heard about what had happened from Tariq, who found him after his evening duties and told him everything. Bilal listened in silence, and when Tariq finished, Bilal did something that surprised them both. He smiled. Not a big smile, not a joyful grin, but a small, quiet smile that carried within it the relief of a man who had been drowning and had finally felt solid ground beneath his feet. Tariq put a hand on his shoulder and squeezed, and neither of them needed to say anything else. The moment said everything. In the weeks that followed, the base continued to transform. The formal review of Arif's conduct proceeded as Nadia had promised, thoroughly and fairly. The evidence was overwhelming, and the consequences were significant. Arif was stripped of his command permanently, demoted in rank, and transferred to an administrative posting far from any position of authority over soldiers. It was not the end of his career, but it was the end of his reign, and the difference between the two was something he would have to reckon with for the rest of his life. Some people might have expected Arif to fight the decision, to appeal, to rage against the system that had finally held him accountable. But something had changed in him on that afternoon in the conference hall. The moment Nadia had said those 4 words, something inside him had shifted. A door that had been locked for decades had been forced open, and behind it was a room full of truths he had been avoiding his entire life. The truth that his father's strength was not about power, but about character. The truth that the respect he had demanded was not respect at all, but submission. The truth that the soldiers he had terrorized were not weak, but were in fact far stronger than he had ever been. because they had endured his cruelty without becoming cruel themselves. Arif did not fight the decision. He accepted it quietly, packed his things, and left the base without ceremony. Some of the soldiers watched him go from a distance, and what they felt was not satisfaction or revenge, but something more complicated. It was the bittersweet recognition that a person who could have been a good leader had chosen to be a tyrant instead, and that the waste of that potential was a tragedy in its own right. Nadia continued her work at the base long after Arif was gone. She promoted Tariq to a position where his experience and his integrity could have the maximum impact. She ensured that Bilal received the recognition and opportunities he had earned through his dedication and perseverance. She mentored Sana, the young woman who had been the first to speak up at that initial meeting with junior soldiers, and watched with pride as Sana grew into a confident, capable soldier who would one day become an officer herself. And she continued to walk the base every single day, visible, present, and accessible. A living reminder that leadership was not about the rank on your shoulder, but about the responsibility in your heart. The story of what happened in that conference hall spread far beyond the base. Soldiers who had been there told their friends at other postings, and those friends told others. And within months, the story of the general who had silenced a bully with 4 words had become something close to legend. It was told in training academies, in officer clubs, in the quiet conversations that soldiers had late at night when they talked about the kind of leaders they wanted to be. And every time the story was told, the message was the same. Real authority does not need to shout. Real strength does not need to intimidate. And real leadership does not need to tear others down to build itself up. Years later, when Nadia finally retired from the military with a record that few could match, and even fewer could understand the true cost of, she was asked in an interview about the moment that defined her career. She thought for a long time before answering, and when she did not talk about the operations she had led, or the crises she had managed, or the awards she had received. She talked about a young soldier she had met on a base years ago, a soldier named Bilal, who had taught her something she had always known but had never been able to put into words. She said that Bilal had shown her that courage was not about standing up to your enemies. Courage was about getting up every single morning and doing your duty even when the people who were supposed to protect you were the ones causing you harm. That, she said, was the truest form of bravery she had ever witnessed, and it was the kind of bravery that she had spent her entire career trying to be worthy of. When asked about the famous 4 words, she smiled softly and said that they were not really about her. They were not about her rank or her gender or her authority. They were about every soldier who had ever been silenced by someone who confused power with strength. They were about every person who had ever been told that they did not belong, that they were not good enough, that they should sit down and be quiet. Those 4 words were a reminder that there is always someone out there who will stand up for you, who will use their position not to dominate but to protect, and who will look the bully in the eye and say with nothing but truth and conviction, enough. And that, in the end, was the real story. Not the story of a general who put a captain in his place, but the story of a base full of people who discovered that they deserved better and finally found someone willing to make sure they got it. It was the story of how a culture built on fear was replaced by a culture built on trust. It was the story of how one woman, armed with nothing but integrity and 4 simple words, reminded an entire institution what it meant to lead. And it was the story of how those 4 words echoed long after they were spoken, traveling through time and distance and memory, carrying with them a truth that no amount of arrogance or aggression could ever silence. I am your general, and in those words lived everything that mattered. Not power, but purpose. Not dominance, but duty. Not the desire to be feared, but the commitment to be fair, and the understanding, hard-won and deeply held, that the measure of a leader is not how loudly they can command a room, but how quietly they can change the lives of the people who trust them to lead.